Hey everybody, Tony D and Little Joan here with should be a lamp video, but I can't do the lamp videos because I gotta record them on my phone and it's a pain in the butt to transfer them out. It takes forever. So I'm gonna do it here. This is the spectrum of that someone did. It's a chart done by Amar Prabhu. What's the difference between a nerd and an intellectual? And he's got these sort of Venn diagrams going. And you've got intellectual, dweeb, weirdo, dork, nerd, crazy, geek, conspiracy nut, and how they all overlap, which I think is kind of funny. Thinking over feeling, obsessed, social klutz, intelligence. Um, yeah, I don't think it's particularly accurate, but the topic of this video is the brain drain that's happening in the fandom, in the geek world. So, to give you a little bit of history, when I was a young geek, and I was a geek, I was with the smart kids. We were into Dungeons and Dragons, Star Trek, Star Wars, all the geek stuff. We were into it all. My friends all read fantasy books, and I read some of them. I read comics. We collected comics. We did little miniature figures sometimes. I really didn't do the figures. I was more of the dungeon master type because I like to write. And so in the 70s and 80s, that's what the nerds did. And a lot of my friends, some of them were high-end computer guys. They went on for, to do big things in the computer world. They had been in a computer club. We'd all been in a computer club. Or they'd gone on to jobs and they were just smart people in general, and they had their own traits and whatnot, but they to this day, a lot of them I still talk to, and they're still into the same kinds of stuff, but the fandom has changed. Back when we were in the fandom in the 70s and 80s, it was very niche, even with Star Wars. Now Star Wars was sort of the beginning of it breaking wide open. Or you can even go back to the original Star Trek. When Star Trek became kind of a cult classic, it happened because it was on television on reruns all the time, and that's when I saw it. Like, I was too young to have seen it when it aired. And in the 70s, I watched it on channel 17 in Philadelphia, which is a know-nothing channel. It wasn't a network channel at that time. And back then, we had three major networks. There was no Fox. It was ABC, NBC, and CBS. And then you had local affiliate channels. You had a PBS channel, and then you had like two or three affiliates. We had 17, 48, and 29. And they would just play reruns 90% of the time. That's all they could afford. They would just, old shows would just run. And sometimes there'd be nothing on the channel. They didn't have news back then. It was just reruns. So I would watch McHale's Navy, Hogan's Heroes, The Three Stooges, Star Trek, all that kind of old stuff. And so did my contemporaries. And when we entered sort of the geek world, going to conventions, going to Dungeons and Dragons events, it was set up by the guys who had come before us, who came out of the 60s. They came out of a world where comics, magazines, and pulp fiction were big, and there was a lot of well-read intellectual people who were in that mix. So you had engineers and scientists, literal engineers and scientists, who would be at these things because that's what they did for fun. In the day you're building a rocket ship, and then at night for fun you're reading fantasy stuff and talking about this with your friends through newsletters, over the phone, or just getting together. So the geek community was a lot smaller, but it was a lot smarter. So you had people who were very intelligent at that time. Even if they weren't particularly politically savvy or socially savvy, they were very good at being engineers, mathematicians, scientists. I mean, these were really smart people, and those were sort of the elders of the comic book convention scene and the Dungeons and Dragons scene. And even if you went to a comic book store, the comic book guy was relatively knowledgeable back then, knew his stuff, because he had come out of that era too. And the the entertainment being produced had been raised on that, so it was still pretty high quality, even though back then even people complained about the quality. People complained, you don't understand, people complained about Return of the Jedi. They complained about it. Oh, Lucas has betrayed his vision, they would say. You know, it's stupid Ewoks. What the hell, man? It wasn't like today where that got talked about endlessly on the internet. This was only in newsletters. This was only in comic book convention panels. The internet didn't exist. We didn't have it. So when we get into the 90s, the geek stuff starts to open up. Comic books became the hot thing. First it was baseball cards, then it was comic books. Well, baseball cards, sports cards in general. Then it was comic books. And when that happened, it was a microcosm of what's happening now to the fandom. So you had us comic book fans who were already in it. It was our thing. And then suddenly hundreds of people came into the hobby, which we had wanted to some extent, but it was immediately overburdened by people who weren't really comic book fans. Now you had some, they were just there, oh, I heard this made money, so now I'm going to get in on it too. So you had guys who would open comic book stores. They didn't give a F about comics. They didn't give two craps about the comics. They were there for the money. And they squeezed it dry for the whole run and then got out if they were smart. There were people who just got caught up in it. Just like people are caught up in woke. They got caught up in comics. They were buying comics. Oh, I heard Superman died. I'm going to buy a comic. Oh, it's going to be worth $1 million when my kids go to college, and then I can pay for college. They didn't know what they were talking about. Prior to 1992, you couldn't convince people to read comics. That they all, if you said to somebody in 1990, hey, do you ever think about reading comics? They'd go, comics are for idiots. After Superman died, if you said, hey, you read comics? Oh yeah, I got a whole collection. I just bought it. I'm going to turn it over in a couple of years. It's going to be worth a lot. Then you couldn't convince them they were worthless. We tried to tell them, like, no, those comics are going to be worthless because they overprinted them. Everybody's in on the game now, so. But it destroyed the fandom because we went from being a close-knit group of fairly intellectual types who were well-versed in the mythos of our comics and well-read in general to every idiot showed up and threw in their 2 cents. And now that comic books are hot, in quotes, that eventually developed into this. It eventually sucked the women into it for some reason. Women suddenly took notice and like, well, if they're not going to stop reading comics, I'm going to be a part of it too. And thus Marvel Comics of today, apparently. But this has happened throughout all the fandom, right? And I saw this in the 90s with the prequels to Star Wars. They were not good. There were really no scientific, there wasn't much scientific basis to Star Wars, the original Star Wars, don't get me wrong. But there seemed to be an acknowledgement of some of it to a small degree. I mean, it was very broad and general, but at the same time, Lucas had borrowed from the Seven Samurai and Lord of the Rings, so if you're going to steal from the best. And he did. But the prequels, it was just a bunch of nonsense as far as I was concerned. There's nothing. There was almost nothing to it. And because of that, it started this degradation. But at the same time, idiots, just like Idiocracy, everybody got in on it. And instead of being like the smartest people in the room, you'd go to a theater and everybody was there. It's kind of like what happened to Facebook. When Facebook first started, it was great. When a lot of these platforms start, they're great because the people who are on them are the savvy ones. Then when everybody gets in on it, when your grandma's in on it, when every idiot is on Facebook and they think they know what they're talking about, it's awful. And that's what happened to the fandom. For everything. For Star Trek. For Star Wars. And I did my video about how the fan base has atomized, and really the geek stuff was sort of the last stuff that had its own base. But not only that, it had grown. It had grown to big proportions because people saw money in it. And in comics, they kind of squeezed that out. They squeezed it dry, destroyed a bunch of comic book stores, and then it destroyed a bunch of new comic book publishers. And then they went away for a while, and then kind of came back a little bit. But they've never reached the heights they had in the 90s with the sales. And they certainly haven't reached the heights they used to have back when people read things. Because they're just awful. And look, there were some decent comic books over the 90s and 2000s, but there was a lot of crap too. Don't kid yourself. You know, the people who say now, oh, woke's ruined everything. No, crap ruins everything. Okay, the woke just exacerbates the problem. But the crap, and there's a lot of crap, it's just, you know, it's people who think there's money in everything doing it based on what they heard somebody else did. And that's what a lot of executives do. People who run the money end of this, and now that there's been money in it, they're running it into the ground because their only objective is to squeeze every dollar out. So to give you another example, I had a friend, a local businessman, decided to invest in his comic because he got in way late. This was in the 2000s at some point. You know, he got in way late in the idea of comics. Like he couldn't have been later in this, right? It had already been the boom and bust, and then came back a little in like 96, I guess. So, you know, by the 2000s it had sort of come back, and this guy said, oh yeah, I'll finance your comic. So he sets him up, he buys him paper, he buys him all the tools he needs, he buys him a computer, pays for a name artist to do his cover, and pays for a full page ad and previews. And they put out they didn't put out the book. What they did, they put it in Previews magazine where people order, and they looked at the orders. And when the orders came in under 1,000, he canceled everything. You know, he had just done it for the money. He took a chance. They didn't get the orders, so he said, "Okay, this will be a tax write-off." He took everything back. I think he let him keep the paper, but he took back the computer and wrote everything off as a big loss, and the comic never came out after this guy really promoted the F out of it and went on and on about how great it was going to be. But it wasn't great. It never even happened because it was about money. And that was sort of the last gasp of that kind of entrepreneurship until the internet had these crowdfunding things. So, what's the new deal? Well, pieces of the internet are breaking off, and you know, even though we are atomized as a geek culture, what used to be the geek culture, there's a new geek culture forming. Now, some of it's forming around Comicsgate. I think that's going to be the future. Some of it's going to form around the Daily Wire and their movies once they start doing more genre-based stuff, and I think they will. Or it'll be another production company or distributor that starts making those movies. And I think they're doing it in horror to some small degree. But I also think the corporate horror is coming. Horror may be the next genre they corporatize to the point of ridiculousness. And wokeness will destroy it too. So, but the intelligent people who used to be a part of this have left. They've left the building because it was part of, I think because of the intimate nature of the smallness of it, they liked it because these smart people tended to, and myself included, tended to be introverts, very introverted, not socially acceptable. But now everybody's doing Star Wars. They've got Star Wars Land, and randos on the street brag about going to Star Wars Land at Disney. It's not the same. It's not the same as I read comic books and everybody thinks you're an idiot, but you're really reading some of the most classic, you know, comic books ever printed, and they're really smart, like Tales from the Crypt and old Eries and stuff like that. So the brain drain from the intellectuals has, to some extent, destroyed the fan base, and it's been replaced partly by wokeness, but just partly by people who want attention. That's why we're down to the cosplayers, right? The cosplayers, they in my view, they provide very little to a convention scene. They're mostly there like a lot of the woke people because they're narcissists and they want attention. Look at me. I have a costume. I'm dressed as Deadpool. Sexy Deadpool. Um, you know, and there's some etiquette to it, and a few cosplayers I don't mind, but when you've got a convention that's mostly cosplayers and they spend all day getting their picture taken, that kind of defeats the purpose of what a convention should be. Like, the convention should be about the comics, the stories. That's what it was about. You know, people didn't gravitate to Star Trek because they wanted the damn plates or the action figures. They gravitated to Star Trek because it was so good. They loved the stories, and they wanted more stories. They wanted more. Original Star Trek was the classic. They left them wanting more. Like, they could have done a 5-year mission. They only did, what was it, 3, 2? I don't remember. 67 episodes. I guess that's 3 seasons, 3.5, 2.5 maybe. But that's gone from a lot of things, right? I mean, they just merchandise, you know, these big ones, they just merchandise everything to death, and other things just get put by the wayside. There's new stuff, and that's what we have to focus on. We have to focus on the new fan base, and we have to get away from these corporate giants because they ruin everything. We have to set a bar high again. We have to have smart people in the fandom again. And we have to, and I don't want it to make it an unwelcoming experience for people who genuinely want to be part of the hobby. But we also don't want to just open the floodgates every time, like we have done with comics and all these other sci-fi things. We have to have, you know, a standard for the fans. Seriously. I'm sick of this fanfic erotic BS that people talk about endlessly. Now they're trying to pass it off as real literature. It's awful. It's awful. These people on Twitter all day long talk about this stuff. It's terrible. Fan fiction is poison now, in my view. Unless you're a kid. If you're a kid, I get it. You're practicing. Write some fan fiction. Don't write any erotic stuff. It's weird. But write some fan fiction. I did it. But I did it while I was a kid, right? I didn't do it. I didn't try to write fan fiction and pass it off as real stuff on the internet. You got to have a standard for yourself too as a fan. Don't be such a fanboy, you know? And don't just get caught up in something just because you liked it before. You know, the original Halloween is great. It's great. The sequels that they're currently doing now, I'll pass. They look a little too overproduced for me. I mean, I'm sure they're fine, but the original was the original. You're never going to get that again. You know, it's John Carpenter. Who's making these movies? I don't know. Jamie Lee Curtis is in it. And they effed him up with some other Halloween movies in between. It's become a franchise. It's corporate. You're dressing up as Michael Myers every Halloween. Like, oh, it's so cool. It's not cool. Everybody does it now. I'm sick of seeing Michael Myers. I mean, that's a weird statement to say. If you had said back in, I don't know, the mid-'80s, like, oh, I'm so sick of seeing Michael Myers, people would be like, Michael Myers? Who the hell's Michael Myers? You know, the guy from Halloween. They've been like, how many people have even seen that movie? Now it's everywhere. So, I guess what I'm saying is we got to have a higher bar for the fans. We got to, I don't know, vet them somehow. I don't want to kick people out of the fan base if you want to be a part of it, but I think we just don't want every rando to be a part of it. You know? Maybe it's not a test, but maybe it's, you know, keeping something more niche. Keeping it niche enough that it doesn't attract those people in the first place, and not allowing the corporate guys just to squeeze every dollar out of it. Anyhow, that's my rant, such that it is. Joan and I will see you tomorrow. Check us out on Bitchute and Rumble.